Suppose that there are some particular needs, wants or desires of a local region that are not met. How do they go about meeting them? In the current, people essentially beg. They beg either the government or industry to do something. The people as such don't really have the capacity to do something themselves, as they lack access to the proper resources to do so at all. In the current, basically this means lack of any money and lack of control over the resources of note. Strangely, of course, they have the labor, the capacity of skills to do so, and the drive to do so. Interestingly enough, industry doesn't typically have any particular reason not to provide for the community, save concerns about money. Similar can be said of government, though due to the complexities of a government/commercial dynamic, the government's role is generally stymied. In a sense, industry is beholden to whomever can afford to pay them, and the laborers are beholden to money in order to live. They can't just work for free after all, winky face. There is a rather simple sense, therefore, in which industry can provide for such unmet needs, wants and desires. Essentially, supply the materials, whereby locals provide the relevant labor. Neither exchanges money. The supply of materials stems primarily, but not exclusively, from the bioregional cottage industries. The fuller explanation of this is given within the discussions on the open gift-giving exchange. The main thrust of that being that the gift-giving exchange is exactly designed to provide for unmet needs, wants and desires. The incentives for doing so remain the same, at the least, free access to all available goods and services, at the most a sense of kindness, generosity, boredom, and recognition that by doing so everyone benefits overall. There isn't any further motivation required, wanted, or desired. Folks who so happen to be laboring in industry, be they the industrial decision-makers, or those that implement the decisions, absent money motivation, absent the illusory need that money provides, have the exact same reasons for doing so that everyone else does. Like everyone else, in other words, they thereby gain free access to all available goods and services. Moreover, as noted elsewhere, part of their incentives for doing so are exactly to enable local labor to do the relevant labors themselves. Overall, in the mid and long term, and obliquely in the short term, by doing so they reduce the overall labor they themselves are doing. Hence, supplying the materials, goods and services that enable the people with unmet needs, wants and desires to do the labors that they ought to do in order to meet those needs, wants and desires is sufficient. In the systemization itself, this is essentially the role of the cottage industrial producers. This concern, though legitimate, is stemming from a misunderstanding of the basics of the systemization. Such may amount to re-explaining how the open gift-giving market works, needs, wants and desires are listed, which thereby tasks the bioregionally bound labor to do the things required to meet them. There is another aspect of this concern that may be underpinning it. How do open gift-giving market failures get rectified? Supposing the following happens: someone lists their needs, wants and desires on the open gift-giving market, and they go unmet. What are the recourses available? Firstly, the reply still entails the open gift-giving market. Specifically, unmet needs, wants and desires may be processed through the OGGM, whereby other locales and bioregions may meet them. If one's own local industries and idiosyncratic producers are not able to meet them, perhaps the adjacent locales, bioregions, and then non-adjacent bioregions. That ordering of priority matters though, as it maintains the localism required to make really any economic functionally operate. The point being that the theoretical concern of an OGGM failure isn't just a failure at a local level, it would have to be a failure on a multiple scalar level all the way up to a global scalar level failure. We may refer to failure on a smaller scalar in the lead up to the creation of a full OGGM, but the answer to that is to more fully enact the open gift-giving market. Secondly, we may reply with the following: assuming a failure on all scalars, we might wonder a bit at what the ask was. Was the ask reasonable? Possible? Plausible? Not to be overly flippant about it, but if we are speaking of alien tech as a request, perhaps the market failure is not really a big surprise. If we are speaking of something far more mundane, like lumber to build a home, that is far more reasonable, and seems fairly unlikely to go unmet in the systemization. If it were to go unmet, that would signal a serious problem with the resources, that is, that there is an actual shortage of the resources of wood, and hence that there is labor involved to fix that, plant more trees. Thirdly, we may reply that such identifies an opportunity for entrepreneurship. An unmet need, want or desire entailing an opportunity for folks to do it themselves. We might again hold that the OGGM simply provides a better resource for people to utilize to identify such things, and to go about the business of rectifying the problem. Fourthly, we may reply that if after all those other replies, the person is still wondering about the unmet needs, wants and desires, it may be the case that we ought ourselves wonder, are they willing to do the relevant labor themselves? In some sense, not a lot need be said about this particular point, in that there are already adapted versions of copyright laws that cover a good deal of the issues. Specifically, Creative Commons copyright laws and a small slew of other similarly minded copyright laws. However, these copyright laws still navigate the moneyed society in one form or another. The attribution aspect of copyright laws may have some value associated with it, particularly as concerns motivation of people to create things of value. What is potentially different in a moneyless society is the various concerns regarding commercial use. It isn't particularly difficult to understand how restrictions on commercial use may seriously impede development. If, after all, new technologies are prevented from use by others, it forces others to either utilize older technologies or potentially develop alternatives. The former is fairly self-explanatory as to why it is likely not a good, and is broadly understood as such within, say, the various fields of the sciences, academics, and arts. Still, it bears detailing here as it relates to a moneyless free labor society. Suppose that an individual or organization develops some product that people find useful, helpful, etc. Others in other locations may want to adopt it. In the current, the developers don't want that, as they are required to work for money rather than working for doof. The more that the developers are able to maintain producing that good, the more money they can make. Such, however, requires more labor on their part. Hence, in the moneyless free labor society, their incentives are to gift that to others who can also do the required labor. In this way, they may still be required to do some of that labor themselves, for instance, to supply for the needs, wants and desires of their relevant set of bioregions. However, they don't have the need to supply any other set of bioregions, preferring instead that those bioregions do the relevant labor themselves. The latter is a bit more complicated. The general concern is that absent the motivation of necessity, would anyone develop some new piece of technology, modality of living, etc.? To some meaningful extent, this question has already been answered via the various free products and services created especially via the internets. Yes, they will continue to develop such things, as they have other motivational factors. This question has also been answered via the various academic fields of note, in that absent any particular barriers to the relevant information, the academics do better in terms of developing new technologies, modalities of living, etc. And it has been answered by the long history of people making a wide variety of things out of boredom, games, crafts, trinkets, tools, etc. There is the possibility that utilizing suffering as a methodology of spurring people on may nonetheless improve the results. In some sense, this is a technical question, but it isn't really quantifiable. It is, in other words, not possible to determine if the freely developed products and services are better or worse, outside of the existing system whereby moneyed concerns are given priority. Let's suppose, however, that it is the case that there is some degree of improvement in development through the metric of suffering. That is, when spurred on by necessity, the need to survive, people will tend to develop methodologies to meet those kinds of challenges better than if they weren't so spurred on. Such runs afoul rather serious ethical concerns. In essence, is torturing people really worth the improved development rate? If so, at what percentages of improvement does such justify it? I generally take such as rhetorical questions. Moreover, insofar as such necessity may be a good thing, there are far more gentle methodologies to achieve the same or similar ends. Playful competition is a thing after all. When competition is no longer playful, however, it loses its ethical foundation. Consider among the many various examples of playful competition, actual play fighting, martial arts competitions, video games, role-playing games, games in general, the Olympic Games, and in the Olympic Games, the competitive playfulness of lovers' musical musings with each other, dance-off competitions, the competitions that occur online with freely produced content, and so on. There really are a wide variety of these kinds of things, so many in fact that they are easy to come across. Such playful competitiveness doesn't have of itself anything like necessity to it. It isn't a survival thing, it doesn't speak to anything particularly deep in the developmental structure of the world. It isn't a riff-off of evolutionary theory, the latter perhaps far more pulling a fast one grift on the beauty inherent in play fighting. It's simply joyful expression of movement, motion, happiness in play with others. For folks not in the know of such things, I'd suggest taking a gander at Bruce Lee's philosophy on martial arts. Or Kayla's rebuke of the modern Klingon warrior spirit. Regardless the proven point that people will compete for gold stars and playfulness, that they will develop new technologies, modalities of living, art, crafts, and so forth without incentives for money, and more pointedly without incentives of necessity to live, entails that the current, basic, or original copyright modalities are ethically unsound and not meaningfully helpful. And that insofar as the copyright laws in the current are stymieing commercial use, they may also ultimately be unethical, in that they pointlessly utilize suffering. Such entails at most that copyrights and intellectual property ought denote points of origin, insofar as such is possible. What may constitute fair use of another's copyrighted material or intellectual property shifts. Things such as the utilization of such materials for unethical purposes may be a concern. The question of concern over such things may, however, be overblown. It may very well be the case that within a moneyless free labor society the underpinning motivations for much of unethical behavior is eliminated. Moreover, such concerns likely run afoul concerns regarding freedoms of expression and speech. You can't use this or that in a way that I don't like very likely tramples upon another person's freedom to say or express themselves. Perhaps, though, the concerns for fair use may be best understood in terms of how music, art, scientific, philosophical, and entertainment are likely to view such things. When others utilize their work in ways that distort their meaning, misinterprets their meaning, etc., whereby that distortion or misinterpretation is thereby attributed to the original creator, may very well constitute unfair use. In pragmatics, such is oft handled through the means of discussion rather than a law. When discussing the meaning of some piece of art, philosophy, music, or scientific theory, these are generally open for discussion as a norm exactly in order to try and understand their meaning, what the creator intended, meant, etc. But there is likely a period of time whereby the creator of such things ought to have control over how to interpret such things. In other words, the creator of such things has the capacity to determine what they meant by something, at the very least so long as they are alive. The creator, after all, has a privileged position relative to exactly those things that they themselves created. Hence, folks may very well hold that in terms of fair use, the original creator of such things has a right to delimit its use by folks, predicated exactly upon at least the issues of distortion and misinterpretation of meaning, intent, etc., of the creator. If folks utilize the Academy's long historical traditions as indicative of how that actually functions, sans business concerns, folks could expect such things as a spirit of generosity on the part of the creators, and an expectation of the same spirit of generosity on the part of those who attempt to utilize their works. To assume the best plausible interpretation of meaning, contextualized works to their cultural and historical context, and to view such efforts as a collaborative effort towards getting at something like, for instance, truth, justice, etc., or even such things as advancements in technology, modalities of life, and so forth. Likewise, a capacity for creators to accept criticism and adjust their positions. Note how little the concern of misinterpretation and distortion of meaning may apply to such things as technology, specific phrases, branding, and in general commercial use. There are, however, concerns regarding standardization, quality control, and safety. To, for instance, grant someone access to some technology may entail that that person changes the design in such a way that the mechanics of it are not the same. In some ways this is good, it enables the possibility of making improvements. In some ways this is bad, in that it entails a lack of modularity in the technology and potentially dangerous adaptations. It is not clear, however, that copyrights are in any way necessary to deal with that kind of concern. After all, there are a lot of incentives to simply adopt the technology in the first place. Insofar as folks may attempt to adapt it, folks may simply say such is a good in the name of innovation, though noting that there are plausibly dangerous aspects thereof that ought, however, be dealt with via other means than concerns of copyright laws. Quality control likewise needn't be dealt with via copyright laws. There are a lot of incentives to simply adopt the technology in the first place, rather than tinkering with it, as the technology is proven. In the current, these kinds of concerns relate more to issues with money than with quality control, the incentives to sell knockoffs, cheap goods, etc. is a thing within a moneyed society, but isn't really a thing within a moneyless society. There being little incentive to do pointless labors. I'd suggest that it would be incumbent upon the critics of a moneyless free labor society to determine plausible incentives to do such pointless labors beyond OIDK psychopathy. Safety concerns are perhaps a thing, though again, IDK that copyright laws are actually a good method of control. Here we are pointing to issues of use of technology for nefarious purposes, making such purposes illegal, and addressing the underpinning motivations folks have for doing nefarious things is a far more effective strategy. The main thrust of this section is to address the possible concerns dealing with proprietary things, especially as concerns so-called intellectual property. The pragmatics of such things as they relate to non-moneyed concerns are what is relevant to the discussion. If, in other words, the only meaningful use for such things is to make money, again, such is such a stupid concern it really is hard to see how anyone can take it seriously. The notion of a copyright law is supposedly to protect innovative ideas so that those who develop from them can profit off of them, thereby incentivizing people to develop innovative ideas. Such is in theory a fine kind of notion. The point of this section is to show how the same and better can be accomplished without the use of money, and to thereby restructure the notion of copyright laws and norms to fit accordingly. Folks unfamiliar with recent history ought well note and review the old debates about open-sourced software, games, etc. Many of the concerns on this topic were addressed, argued for, and tested in the past 40 years or so as of this writing. Many of the talking points in favor of a moneyed copyright kind of concern that folks are likely to bring up in this regard have generally already been proven false, not only on an argumentative level, but also on a pragmatic level. As in, these things have already been made, tested against massive corporate entities not doing it, and have come out on top, or at any rate, with products, goods and services that are at the least comparable. This section adds some modest changes to the notion as they relate to a fully moneyless society. Although fairly well addressed already and further explained in later sections, I want to more directly address the possible concern that the system as a whole will tend towards the decline of labors. The concern is that, for instance, if people are not required to work at some non-essential task, wherein it is understood that essential labors are a kind of separate category, is it the case that over time the variety of goods and services available within any given bioregion will decline? I take this kind of concern as something like a concern of how the metrics of what constitutes surplus labor in a system are determined, and that within a moneyless free labor society, in essence, people will tend to work less and less through each iteration of the system, wherein an iteration is at the least understood as each successive generation, and at most some far quicker process, such as, for instance, individuals choosing which labors they do. For instance, perhaps it's the case that the various beautician commercial trades diminish as people iteratively choose to not take on those jobs. Perhaps the assumption therein being that people actually prefer to have someone else do those kinds of tasks. I want to suggest rather strongly that the exact hows that such things are done is of less importance than folks seem to think. If people want to have those things, they will tend to do them. If, In other words, there is a critical mass of people who enjoy such things. There will be some subset of those people who would choose to do them as a matter of how they do their required labor hours in society. Moreover, the exact hows that people do the beautician's trade, be that commercially, or in their homes, or in little gatherings of people who make a day of it, doesn't matter in the sense of if people are actually getting to partake in the goods and services associated with the beautician's trade. In other words, as with other kinds of activities, when labor is gifted back their surplus labor, we ought expect that people who are interested in such things will tend to do it themselves, perhaps with friends, and perhaps some will choose to make that their trade, as in, utilize a community space to provide those kinds of goods and services to others. It doesn't really matter that such goods and services may be provided in-home or out of home. What matters to people is that they are provided. Hence, when speaking of these kinds of concerns of decline of labor, folks are missing the point as to the purpose and pragmatics of labor. Labor for labor's sake is not really a good thing. Labor that is productive entails merely that the good or service is being provided. What we might expect at most, in other words, is that labor outside the home declines, but labor overall continues. Its location may shift to in-home or idiosyncratic or towards shared community gathering, but the labor as such persists. And note that there isn't any good reason to suppose that such a shift would be wholesale, as there are significant incentives for laborers to prefer industrial labor, as industrial labor doesn't require as much labor overall. There is a subset of concern here that involves to what degree do people really need required work hours. That is, to what extent is it the case that the hands of labor, given the proper tools, actually require anything like a law overhead that entails that they have to work such and such a number of hours. The assumption therein being something like, with access to the open gift-giving market and the relevant data, is it possible that there need be no common understanding at all regarding how many hours any individual or familial unit has to work? Are people grown up enough to not require such things at all? Perhaps put a bit more realistically, assuming some kind of educational system that teaches such things as responsibility to the individual, family, and community, would people's general dispositions towards kindness, generosity, desire to do the right thing, etc., itself be sufficient? It's a bit more dubious, but we may even wonder at the capacity of people to do so absent any particular education that teaches those kinds of things at all. In other words, we may ponder to what degree, after all, does the educational system create exactly those kinds of problems wherein people learn to not be kind, generous, do the right sort of thing, etc. Granting to the educational system that in terms of technical knowledge, learning how to do a trade, how to understand the world in general, remains relevant. This latter more dubious assumption is in some ways more appealing. However, it is seriously worth noting that such depends a lot on where the species is as a matter of cultural understanding. In some meaningful sense, an educational system acts as a correcting force regarding various dispositions of the species towards exactly the kinds of problematic behaviors that are prevalent within a given culture. Important to recall therein that anything like public education is a rather new phenomenon, and that hence it is unlikely to be the case that the current educational system is meaningfully to blame for the behaviors of the species in general throughout the overwhelming majority of its existence. Absent any kind of public educational operati, to be blunt, entails the creation of Information bubbles whereby each section of the population is essentially ignorant of all other sections of the population, which seriously risks many of the old-timey concerns, such as wars, racism, cultural stagnation, etc. Folks may in any given subset of the population manage to relate well to each other absent any kind of formal education, but if history is at all a good indicator, how they would tend to think of and treat others outside that subset would be terrible. The former, more plausible claim deserves some serious consideration. In the current wherein the Internet provides for a kind of education regarding other peoples without any formal structure to it, as such entails the capacity for people to learn about people outside their own subset of the population. Given that, and assuming that the communications structure can actually be cleaned up in regards to all the really dumb shit on it masquerading as educational content, it is possible, for instance, for children to be raised in an environment whereby those kinds of virtues are the norm without any particular need to include such things in the formal educational operati associated with learning about trades, crafts, scholastics, etc. Such subverts the familial dispositions to teach merely whatever they so happen to know, and subverts any sort of overarching state or corporate control over teaching specific things regarding proper behavior, and so forth. Notable therein, in a moneyless free labor society, much of the incentives to do crimes is absent. See Section 13A, Real Benefits, Minimization of Thievery and Criminal Behavior. The question becomes, assuming those sorts of things, would people choose to work at places that are desirable in a community sense, but not necessarily desirable in an individual sense? We can abrogate this between essential labors and inessential labors, though by doing so we are already insinuating that there are at least some jobs that are required, and hence some amount of labor hours of work that are required. How to divvy up such labors is covered elsewhere. In terms of non-essential labors that are nonetheless highly organized, there is something of an answer provided elsewhere in this piece. Absent any particular requirement, people are still inclined to want to work at something or another. However, the question is a bit more complicated in that, for instance, theme parks, movie theaters, etc., all require aspects of labor that few are really interested in doing. It may be the case, however, that people would nonetheless choose to do such things in order to have these kinds of places. The exact means whereby labor is distributed within such a place may differ from the standard. For instance, it may be the case that undesirable jobs within such places are shared labor, people taking turns at it, or having the labor be subsumed within the duties of other jobs. For instance, cleanup may just be something that everyone there does as a part of whatever other job they have at the place, or it may be that people take turns doing cleanup. This kind of disposition is a little bit libertarian and a little bit anarchistic. Likewise, I think people tend to assume, wrongly, that everyone wants the labors that are associated with more prestigious positions within a given organization. Certainly within a system whereby such and such number of hours of work per week are required, there will be a non-trivial number of people who prefer such labor. It is relatively simple, leaving time and energy for other things, etc. Still, absent the requirement to labor in total, save perhaps the essential labors, would individuals take on the various undesirable tasks within any given organization as their primary duty, rather than sharing in those various labors. After all, it may be the case that there are some labors that are not realistically shareable. There is something therein to be said for structure within an organization. In other words, if someone wants to do some more desirable labor within an organization, they have to go through the process doing the less desirable labors therein. Entry-level positions, fairly classic apprenticeship models, hiring from within the organization as a priority, etc. In other words, all the various less desirable kinds of labors in a given organization can be divided up fairly via a system, whereby everyone within the organization has priority of internal hiring, and learning the organizational structure entails starting at the entry-level positions, which are, we are supposing, the less prestigious and less desirable sorts of positions. Hence, folks might want to work at the theme park, but doing so entails starting off in the less desirable positions therein that they may not have wanted. But over time, the organization provides folks specifically with opportunities to advance within that organization to the more desirable occupations. I'd suggest too that not making any given position too undesirable by sharing otherwise undesirable duties would be helpful, as there is only so much room for movement within any given organization at any given time. Therein would remain the plausibility of experience requirements as a method of bypassing entry-level positions. In essence, if someone has already gone through the entry-level positions, there isn't a whole lot of sense of fairness to make them go through the entry-level positions again. In the current, there is an issue of folks jumping between organizations to make money and advance their careers, which overall has deleterious effects on the various organizational structures and the sense of fairness towards internal hiring. I'd suggest that absent the motivations of moneyed concerns, this sort of behavior would diminish. The motives for doing so may remain to, for instance, get out of a particularly undesirable position within an organization whereby there is little hope for advancement within it, or simply because some other organization seems more appealing to work at. But I'd suspect that there is less to the notion of undesirability of a position, given that everyone has more or less equal access to all the goods and services. I'd also suggest that such is a fair reason why someone who has already been in the undesirable position might choose to no longer be in said position. The point, though, is that many of the motives to jump ship shift and diminish within a moneyless free labor society. Folks may even prefer to maintain positions on the lower rungs of an organization as it is comfortable, suits their needs, wants and desires, and provides for the same. Note that this dovetails well with other aspects of the Moneyless Free Labor Society explained elsewhere in this piece. It also draws upon not-so-old-timey wisdoms regarding the importance of work ethics, loyalty between those in an organization, and honestly expresses as solution a lot of the kinds of concerns businesses and labor organizations regularly express. Within that, there are some issues associated with hiring outsiders, or fairly hiring outsiders to the organization. I would suggest that the laws associated with equal employment opportunities are likely sufficient to deal with this, though I'd also suggest that folks reference other aspects of this piece that handle concerns of labor, to get a sense of how this would likely pan out. The following may be motivating the concern. Suppose that there are required work hours for essential services, and that what is considered essential is quantifiable. People have all their basic needs met by doing their part. Why would anyone do any additional labors? What strikes me as odd about this particular kind of concern is that it runs counter to the intuition that if given the choice, people would tend to choose useless labors, frivolity, or be entertainers and so forth. It is as if the folks that express this kind of concern are on the one hand holding that people will choose to do frivolous sorts of things if no one is around to whip them into doing the real labors of life, and on the other hand they are holding that if given the option to only do the essential labors, people won't have any motivation to do the frivolities. Supposing that after all the essentials are met, the propensity for the species to do something fun, exciting, interesting, etc., entails that they would tend towards doing exactly those kinds of things. Suppose that there is some good or service that is currently being provided. Someone's want to join that organization because they prefer that kind of labor. Alas, there are no openings within that organization. What they gonna do? They could join some other organization that does have openings. They may simply choose not to do any labor outside the home. They may found their own organization centering on that kind of labor, or they may do that kind of labor on their own. Keeping in mind that even if people are not doing labor outside the home, their in-home labor is valuable. As in, if they are doing their own nails, beautician sorts of things, or if they are doing the upkeep on their houses. If they are taking care of themselves, at the very least such entails that they are providing for themselves, and hence, removing some amount of the labor that would otherwise be in the system. Such in-home labors can and often enough do also provide folks with the capacity for novelty, relative uniqueness in style and form, and the ability to select for value in ways that may not otherwise be taking place, value that is apparent at in-home personal scalars. Such may also entail the more valuable sorts of labors associated with child rearing, which is in-home labor that is essential, insofar as people want the species to continue, which of course they don't have to. As for the other options they may choose to do, any of those options are desirable. Entrepreneurship, related to in-home labors, finding another organization to join, going through some educational process, etc. Suppose they try to join the organization, and there is an opening. Well, they enter in an entry-level position and learn the trade on the job, doing whatever are the less desirable labors in the process. Such may entail some relatively minor restructuring of the organization to better enable on-the-job learning of the relevant trade, but such is hardly an impossible, improbable, or even particularly difficult task. Note that such runs counter to the currents whereby organizations try to hire from outside the organization, or folks try to use education as a means of skipping the entry-level positions. That particular point is given some attention elsewhere in this piece. In regards to the question of if people would simply choose to do the kinds of labor that are essential if they can freely choose not to, I think it likely that at least many, perhaps most of such labors are desirable kinds of labors. That is, that they meet the needs, wants and desires of the laborers themselves. I do, however, admit that such is an underdetermined point. The safer methodology, as noted elsewhere in this piece, is that the essential labors can be done by a small number of people, and can constitute in essence a kind of rite of passage. As the youth enter the labor force, their first labors are exactly those essential labors. They age out of it and enter into the non-essential labors, whereby they freely choose their labors beyond the essential labors. Noting here, though, that we are realistically speaking of entry-level positions. Perhaps more pertinent to the concern is that freely chosen labors are not limited to essential labors. The delineation between the essential and non-essential are not to thereby entail that there is a forced aspect to the one and a non-forced aspect to the other. It is to entail that there is a priority given to the one that is not given to the other in terms of educating people as to what those distinctions are, adverts for them, and perhaps indicative of roles of government to act as a fail-safe mechanism as discussed elsewhere in this piece. The main thrust for this section is that the concern for a declining of labors if folks are not forced to labor seems very much like masters' concerns. Though I've tried to address these concerns with an aplomb to display that given the choice, freely chosen labor actually does tend towards the doing of labors, and indeed of the real concerns section in total, that freely chosen labor sans the whips of money's lashes does far and away better than with the many lashes. I may also address it by noting that the concerns are strongly reminiscent of the kinds of concerns that masters of slaves have. Are the slaves going to know what to do? Will the slaves think to feed themselves if master doesn't help them? Will the slaves be able to figure out how to drink water without master around to show them? Can the slaves even yet think for themselves? But, will the slaves know how to have fun if master doesn't direct them to do so?
Sa chitaway,